Chapter 3 of How Progress Ends examines a central puzzle in economic history. Why did sustained technological progress emerge in Europe rather than in other advanced societies? Carl Frey argues that the answer is not simply better ideas or superior inventors. Instead, he focuses on institutions, the political and economic structures that shaped who had power and how economic change was managed. Within that broader argument, one mechanism stands out: the role of guilds. Guilds were powerful economic institutions that both supported and constrained development. Understanding how they functioned and why the resistance to innovation did not permanently stop progress helps us explain the larger institutional story Frey is telling. Innovation is usually presented as something everyone should want. It increases productivity, lowers costs, and raises living standards. But economic history shows a repeated pattern. Many of the groups most affected by innovation actively resisted it. Carl Frey argues that this resistance isn't irrational or accidental. Instead, it's driven by incentives, particularly the incentives of groups whose livelihoods are threatened by economic change. To understand this, we first need to understand what guilds were and why they existed. Guilds were associations of skilled workers and producers that controlled entry into trades, training, and production standards. They organized apprenticeships, regulated who could practice a craft, and enforced quality rules. In an economy without modern schools or professional certification, this mattered a lot. Economically, guilds provided stability. They preserved specialized skills, reduced uncertainty for consumers, and ensured that knowledge was passed down from generations. From this perspective, guilds weren't backward institutions. They were functional responses to a risky and fragmented economic environment. Another way to think about guilds is as early forms of economic insurance. By regulating who could enter a trade and how production occurred, guilds reduce uncertainty for both workers and consumers. In unstable pre-industrial economies, that stability had real value. But the downside of that insurance was rigidity. Once production methods were locked in, change became threatening rather than beneficial. This set up the central tension of the chapter. Institutions that solve one economic problem can create another when conditions change. Guilds were designed to protect existing methods of production. When new tools or techniques emerged, especially labor-saving ones, they threatened the livelihoods of guild members. This created a conflict between maintaining stability and allowing economic change. So the key question becomes, if guilds had both the incentive and the power to resist innovation, why didn't they succeed in stopping progress altogether? To answer that, we need to look more closely at the economic incentives behind guild resistance and why those incentives clash with broader social outcomes. To understand that resistance more clearly, the next section looks at incentives driving guild behavior and why blocking innovation often made sense at the individual level.
Part of this Chapter 3 group. Before looking more closely at the incentives behind guild resistance, it's worth zooming out briefly. Guilds were not unique to Europe, and resistance to innovation was not unusual historically. What makes Europe distinctive in Frey's account, however, was not that guilds were weaker or less organized, but that they operated within a broader institutional environment that limited how much power any one group could exercise over time. This matters because it shifts the explanation away from culture or attitudes toward technology. The question isn't whether people liked innovation, spoiler alert, many didn't, but whether institutions allowed resistance to become permanent. With that context in mind, we can now look more closely at why resistance made sense at the individual level. even when it slowed economic growth overall. From an economic standpoint, guild resistance to innovation was often rational. Guild members were incumbents. Their income, job security, and social status depended on existing production methods. When a new technology reduced labor demand, lowered prices, or allowed outsiders to compete, it directly threatened those benefits. At the microeconomic level, resisting innovation was a form of self protection. A labor saving device might increase total output, but for individual artisans, it could mean lower wages, loss of status, or even unemployment. So while innovation improved efficiency overall, it imposed concentrated costs on specific groups. This creates a classic economic conflict between private incentives and social efficiency. What benefits society as a whole could potentially harm individuals within the system, and those individuals would often have strong reasons to push back. Economists would often describe this kind of situation as a distributional conflict. Innovation doesn't just increase output, it changes who benefits from production. While society may gain in the long run, the losses are immediate and concentrated among specific groups. Because those losses are concentrated, incumbents like guild members are often highly motivated and well organized. In contrast, the benefits of innovation are spread across consumers and future producers who have weaker incentives to mobilize. This imbalance helps explain why resistance can be so persistent, even when innovation is economically beneficial overall. Guilds use several methods to resist innovation. They restricted the use of new tools, limited output levels, enforced traditional techniques, and blocked entry by non members. Importantly, guilds weren't necessarily anti technology in general, they were anti disruption, especially when change threatened their economic position. This explains why resistance to innovation appears repeatedly across history. The issue isn't ignorance nor fear of change, it's incentive alignment. People act to protect their livelihoods. However, if resistance was so economically rational and so well organized, the puzzle remains. Why didn't it permanently halt progress? The answer lies The answer lies not in changing attitudes, but in institutional limits. Guilds could resist innovation locally, but they lacked the power to suppress it everywhere. Resistance delayed progress, but it couldn't eliminate it entirely. That brings us to the role of institutions, specifically how Europe's political and economic structure constrained the power of incumbents. This next section explains why guild resistance, despite being rational and persistent, ultimately failed to stop long-run economic growth.
What ultimately limited guild resistance was Europe's institutional environment. Guild power was typically local. Europe was politically fragmented, made up of competing cities and regions rather than a single centralized authority. This fragmentation created an important escape valve: exit. If innovation was blocked in one city, producers and skilled workers could reallocate to another where local authorities were more willing to allow change. Cities competing with each other for merchants' labor and tax revenue, which was meant suppressing for innovation, came at a cost. Local rulers faced a trade-off: protecting guilds could maintain stability in the short run, but allowing innovation often expanded the economic base. Over time, competition pushed many cities to loosen restrictions, even against the wishes of incumbents. This competitive pressure meant that institutional change often happened gradually rather than all at once. Innovation didn't replace old systems overnight. Instead, it emerged unevenly through negotiation, conflict, and experimentation across different cities. Some regions adopted new methods earlier, while others lagged behind. But as successful innovations demonstrated their economic advantages, pressure mounted for wider adoption. This gradual diffusion is where Frey emphasizes that progress is often delayed, but rarely stopped entirely, when institutional escape routes exist. Frey emphasizes that it doesn't mean guilds were purely harmful. They slowed innovation, but they also preserved skills and reduced uncertainty. The critical factor wasn't whether guilds existed, but whether institutions allowed their power to be challenged. In decentralized systems, resistance became temporary. Innovation was delayed, negotiated, and uneven, but it survived. In centralized systems, resistance could be enforced uniformly and permanently. This distinction helps explain long-run growth differences across societies. Progress doesn't require universal support for innovation. It requires institutions that prevent powerful groups from blocking change indefinitely. This insight still applies today. Modern debates over automation, artificial intelligence, and regulation affect the same tension. Incumbent workers and firms often resist technologies that threaten established roles, even when those technologies raise productivity. The lesson from Frey's analysis is that resistance is inevitable. What determines outcomes is whether institutions allow experimentation and competition to continue that resistance. What this chapter ultimately shows is that innovation doesn't need universal support to succeed. It only needs space to survive somewhere. When institutions allow experimentation, even in a few places, successful ideas can spread over time. One of the most important implications of Frey's analysis is that progress does not require consensus. In fact, innovation often advances in environments where opposition is strong. What matters instead is whether institutions allow experimentation to continue in some places, even when it's blocked in others. When exit and competition are possible, successful innovations can spread over time, gradually reshaping economic systems. This helps explain why economic development is often uneven and delayed rather than smooth and immediate. Progress emerges through conflict, negotiation, and institutional constraints, not through universal agreement. The broader takeaway is simple but powerful. Economic progress depends less on inventing new technologies and more on designing institutions that limit the ability of incumbents to stop them. Thank you so much.